The cold, damp stone of the small chamber presses against your bare skin as you wake. The air is thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and olive oil, an odor that has come to define your existence in this place. You're in a small, windowless room where time seems to stretch endlessly, each day blending into the next with no distinction. The sound of distant laughter from the main house reaches your ears, echoing off the stone walls. It's not the light-hearted laughter of family or friends, but the cruel, mocking laughter of those who are free, a sound that makes your stomach tighten with dread. Your body aches, bruises, blooming purple and yellow across your ribs like grotesque flowers. The iron shackle around your ankle is a constant reminder of your captivity. It's rubbed the skin raw, and each movement sends sharp pains up your leg. You wince as you try to stand. Your hands tremble, though you've long grown accustomed to the pain and the cold. There is no use trying to sleep through it anymore. You know what's coming. The overseer's footsteps approach, heavy sandals clicking on marble floors. You know that sound too well. It's time for another day of service. The overseer, a mountain of muscle and scars, enters, his shadow falling over you. He doesn't speak at first, there's no need. He throws a damp cloth at your feet with a growl, and his eyes scan you like a trader inspecting livestock. You're going to help entertain the master's guests again tonight. The words hit you like a slap, and the tightness in your throat is impossible to ignore. You know what that means. You've known since the first night they dragged you from your village, since they told you that your family's debts had been paid in the only currency they had left. You, 15 years old, the words echo in your mind, though you stopped counting birthdays the moment you became property. Time moves differently when you're not allowed to decide how it's measured. The overseer's eyes flick over you again with cold calculation, as if making sure you're ready for another day of torment. You can't move fast enough to escape, so you reach for the thin tunic crumpled in the corner. As you pull it on, you know that another day in this prison is beginning. The thought of the master's guests fills you with a sickening sense of dread, but there is no room for fear anymore. Only survival. The door scrapes open, and harsh sunlight pours in, blinding you momentarily. You squint against the light, raising a trembling hand to shield your eyes, but there's no escaping the reality of your existence. The overseer's silhouette looms in the doorway, the heavy sound of his sandals filling the space as he steps forward. His eyes already scanning you for flaws, for any sign of resistance. "Clean yourself," he growls, his voice low and cruel. It's a command, but it's also a reminder. You exist to serve, to be useful. The master has important guests coming tonight, and once again your body will be used to entertain them. Your throat tightens, but you don't respond. What is there to say? They know your silence, your compliance, your pain. It's all part of the system. You've learned that by now. You can feel the overseer's cold gaze lingering on you, like a predator sizing up its prey. You know what's expected of you. The reality is simple, brutal, and unforgiving. This is your world now, and it's been your world for longer than you care to remember. As you begin to clean yourself, the overseer watches, his arms crossed over his chest. His gaze is unrelenting, like the unfeeling eyes of a man who has seen too much suffering to care about the pain of others. The coldness of his stare doesn't even faze you anymore. You've learned how to disappear into yourself, how to keep your head down and your thoughts as distant as possible. But deep down, you know there's a part of you that hasn't given up yet. Maybe it's foolish, maybe it's a faint hope you'll never speak aloud, but it lingers. It's the only thing you have left. The thought that maybe, one day, there will be something more than this. For now though, the overseer's voice interrupts your fleeting thoughts. Hurry up, you've got a long night ahead of you. His tone is matter of fact, as though this is just another day in a life that is no longer your own. You nod and stand, already resigning yourself to the inevitable. Another night of forced smiles and empty laughter. Another night where your body isn't yours, where your mind will scream in silence while your physical form serves the whims of others. Another night where you are nothing but a tool, a pawn in their game. And yet, despite the weight of it all, there is a flicker inside you, a faint, dying ember that refuses to be extinguished. Your story began long before the cold stone walls of the chamber became your only world. It began in a small rural village, where families lived on the edge of survival. In this world, the seasons were not measured in warmth or cold, but by the crops that grew or failed. A bad harvest, a broken leg, a sudden death, any of these could push a family into a debt they would never escape. The soil that once nourished them now only fed their misery, and soon the creditors would come calling. Your family was no different. A drought had ravaged the olive groves, leaving your father's back bent from work that bore no fruit. The barley fields were scorched, the wells running dry. There were days when your mother would look out at the horizon, the weight of unspoken words heavy between her lips. You never fully understood the gravity of it. You were a child too young to grasp the full implications of what was happening. But your father's gaze, filled with helplessness, said it all. One evening, after the last goat had been sold, after the jewelry your mother had worn for years was exchanged for a handful of silver coins, your family made the ultimate decision. It was the night when they sold you. At first you didn't understand what was happening. They told you it would be temporary. They promised it was just for a little while, that you would earn money and return home. It seemed like an opportunity, something to lift the burden from your parents' shoulders. But their eyes, your father's shaking hands as he took the silver, told a different story. The men who came to collect you were not kind, nor were they cruel in the way you'd come to know. They were businesslike, indifferent to the cries of children. They were the merchants of misery peddling flesh for silver. Their chains clinked like a grim symphony, signaling the start of a life you could never escape. They took you to the village center, where others like you had already been gathered, young boys and girls, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies too small for the burdens they would carry. The air smelled of desperation, and the transactions proceeded as if you were nothing more than livestock being sold to the highest bidder. You didn't know it then, but your father's hands had sealed your fate. He had signed away your future, trading your innocence for survival. The words they used, good breeding, suitable for service, meant nothing to you. You were only 12, too young to understand the language of power and poverty. What you understood was that your life was no longer yours to decide. The journey to Athens was a nightmare. You and the other slaves were chained together, a caravan of bodies moving toward an uncertain future. The roads were long and the heat unbearable. You marched alongside older boys who tried to console you with tales of what awaited, but they only spoke of survival. The older ones had already learned that hope was a fleeting illusion. The world outside, with its rolling hills and bright coastal roads, became a blur. You no longer saw the beauty of the land. Your world had shrunk to the length of chain that bound you. The rhythm of your feet striking stone, the distant haunting cries of those around you. The overseers didn't care for your pain. They didn't care for anything except getting you to the city, where your life would begin in earnest. At night, they chained you to stakes driven into the ground. The cold earth beneath you was a harsh comfort compared to the constant weight of the iron collar around your neck. You were just one of many, a part of the machinery that kept the system running. The overseers would sometimes bring visitors to inspect their merchandise. Men in fine clothing who smelled of wine and perfumes, their eyes scanning your body with a cold interest. They had seen countless boys like you, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. The sound of their voices, low and calculating, filled the air. Their fingers lingered on your skin, and their eyes lingered longer still. They weren't looking for strength, not like the farmers who wanted boys for labor. No, they were looking for something else, something younger, more beautiful, something that could serve their desires. You tried to shrink into yourself, to make your body as small as possible, but there was no escaping the gaze of the men who walked among you. They prodded, poked, and examined you, their touch lingering where it shouldn't. You were being evaluated, not for your worth as a person, but for your worth as property. It was an experience you would come to know all too well. When the auctioneer's voice rang out across the market, it was as though time itself had stopped. You stood on the platform, a piece of merchandise to be sold. The eyes of the buyers were upon you, each one sizing you up, calculating the price they were willing to pay for you. The bids started low, but they climbed quickly as more men joined the competition. You were cleaned and oiled before your sale, not out of kindness, but because clean merchandise fetched a higher price. The oil made your skin gleam in the sunlight, highlighting the muscles you had developed during your journey. And yet, no matter how polished your exterior, You knew what you were, an object, not a person. The winning bid was called out, and you were sold. A man named Lysander, middle-aged and well-fed, stepped forward, his eyes already claiming you as his eyes. The transaction was completed in silence. The silver was counted out into the merchant's hand, and you were no longer a boy from the countryside. You were now his possession, and there was no turning back. The house you would be brought to was far grander than anything you had ever seen. A mansion built with wealth and power, a place where men like Lysander lived above the law. Marble columns, ornate mosaics, and servants who flitted about in the background, all of it a stark contrast to the world you had known. But no amount of beauty could erase the cold truth: you were no longer free. The journey to Athens had been long, but it had not prepared you for the spectacle that awaited you at the slave market. The moment you entered the city, the air changed. It was thicker, heavier, with the scent of sweat, body oils, and the stench of fear that clung to every corner. You had seen cities before, but none like this, none that were built on the backs of those who had been forgotten. You were led through narrow streets, packed with crowds, and the noise was deafening. Merchants shouting, buyers haggling, the clang of chains, and the murmur of the desperate. The sun beat down relentlessly, but the heat was nothing compared to the scorching reality that awaited you. You had been sold, but here, in the slave market, you were about to be truly discarded. The platform was raised high, allowing all eyes to see. You were made to stand there, your body exposed for inspection, while a crowd of potential buyers circled around you like vultures over fresh carrion. Each buyer inspected you the same way, their hands running over your skin, feeling the muscles in your arms, checking the strength of your grip, even peering into your mouth to examine your teeth. You felt nothing at all, as if you had turned into stone, your mind retreating to a faraway place where no one could touch you. But you could feel their eyes, hungry and calculating, sizing up your worth. You had learned long ago that you were no longer human to these people. You were just a thing to be bought and sold, like a goat or a donkey, something that could serve a purpose, but had no inherent value outside of it. As the bidding began, the men in the crowd stepped forward, their voices low and demanding. 15 drachmas, one shouted, and another countered with 20. The numbers climbed, but none of it mattered. You had already been sold in your mind long before the silver had been counted out. A man named Lysander won the bid, though his name meant nothing to you then. All you saw was the smile that spread across his face as he stepped forward to claim you. He was well dressed, his tunic dyed the rich purple that marked him as a man of wealth and status. His hands were soft, untouched by labor, and his eyes gleamed with a satisfaction that sent a chill through your spine. He stepped forward, running his gaze over you like a man admiring a piece of art. "I'll take this one," he said, his voice rich and filled with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. The auctioneer nodded, and in that moment, you were no longer a boy. You were a commodity, an object, and your life no longer belonged to you. Lysander handed over the silver with a flick of his wrist, his eyes still locked on you, and then turned, signaling for you to follow. The overseers who had controlled you during the journey no longer mattered. They had completed their task, and now it was time for you to begin your new life. You followed Lysander without a word, the chains around your neck weighing you down, pulling you to a place where you would no longer be a child but a thing for someone's pleasure. As you were led through the city to Lysander's house, you could see the wealth that surrounded him, the marble columns, the mosaics, the well-dressed people who moved with an air of superiority. It was a far cry from the small village where you had been born, where life had been difficult, but at least it had been your own. Here, you were nothing. Inside the house, you were shown to your quarters. The floors were marble, the walls adorned with fine tapestries and expensive art. The servants who moved through the halls looked at you with pity, their faces masked with practiced indifference. They were all like you, slaves, trapped in a system that allowed no freedom. You weren't the first to be brought here, and you wouldn't be the last. Lysander's household was large, full of men who carried themselves with the weight of their power. They were intellectuals, philosophers, and politicians, men who had built their reputations on ideals of justice and democracy. The irony of it was lost on them. They talked about virtue while enslaving the helpless, discussing the nature of the good life while treating the very people who served them as less than human. But it was the overseer, Demetrius, who truly held power here. He had been a slave once, but through cunning and ruthlessness, he had worked his way up to a position of authority. Now, he managed the household slaves with a cold efficiency, understanding the mechanics of breaking spirits better than anyone. It was his voice that would decide when you ate, when you slept, and what kind of service you would provide. As he led you through the house, explaining the rules, you realized just how far gone you were. You would eat when told, sleep when told, bathe when told, and never, under any circumstance, look a free person directly in the eyes. It wasn't just about submission, it was about erasing any sense of self. You were here to serve Lysander and his guests. Your body was no longer your own. The concept of dignity was foreign to you now. You would be molded into something useful for their pleasures, their whims, and their entertainment. It was in this house, beneath the gilded halls and between the luxurious walls, that you would lose the last fragments of who you had been. The house of Lysander was vast, a grand estate nestled in the wealthiest part of Athens. It was the kind of place that spoke of power, both political and personal. Its walls were adorned with intricate mosaics depicting gods and heroes, beings revered by men who had no qualms about turning another human being into an object to be used and discarded. The marble floors gleamed in the sunlight, and the air was thick with the scent of incense and luxury, a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive chamber you had come from. Lysander's home was a palace of excess, where opulence poured from every corner. The servants who scurried about were dressed in fine linen, their movements quick and precise, as if they feared the wrath of their masters. The house was constantly bustling with activity, guests arriving, food being prepared, and the faint hum of intellectual debates that filled the air. As the great minds of Athens gathered in private rooms to discuss matters of philosophy, politics, and art. But you, the newest addition to this house, were never meant to participate in those discussions. No, you were to serve. You had become part of the machinery that allowed men like Lysander to live in such luxury, a mere cog in a system that ran on the exploitation of those beneath them. And like every cog, your worth was determined by your usefulness. Your first few days in the house were a blur. Demetrius, the overseer, was harsh, his eyes always watching, never missing a detail. He explained the rules of your new life, rules that would govern every waking moment from here on out. The first rule, obedience. You would speak when spoken to, and never question orders. If you made a mistake, if you hesitated or defied your masters, the consequences would be swift and brutal. Do not speak unless spoken to, Demetrius instructed as he led you through the house. Do not look any of the free men in the eyes, no matter who they are. You are here to serve, and that is all. You nodded, your throat tightening. You had heard of slaves like you, used for entertainment, for the pleasures of their masters and their guests. It wasn't a life, it was a slow death of the spirit, but there was no choice. You had learned that much early on. Survival was the only option, and survival meant submission. You were shown to your quarters, which were nothing like the rooms the free servants had. They were small, stone-walled cells with a thin mattress on the floor and a chamber pot in the corner. It was bare, cold, and unwelcoming, but it was your space, for now, a place where you could retreat when the world outside became too much to bear. As you lay on the mattress at night, trying to find sleep in the discomfort, you heard the whispers of the other slaves. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid to be overheard by the overseers or the masters. Marcus, a boy your age, had been here for 2 years, and he had learned how to survive. His eyes were dull, worn down by time, but his words were sharp. You'll learn fast, he said one night, his voice low. You have to know what they want before they even ask. Know what they like, and be ready to give it. Marcus had been broken, as most slaves were, but his survival had given him something others lacked: knowledge. You'll serve at the symposiums, he continued. The master's guests, they come for more than just food and wine, they come for entertainment. And you'll entertain them. The words haunted you as you tried to sleep. The symposiums, you had heard of them, gatherings where men of intellect and wealth would debate philosophy, politics, and art. But what you hadn't known, what Marcus had warned you about, was the dark truth behind them. The symposiums were not just about ideas and discussions, they were about power. The power to take, to dominate, and to control, and you as a slave would be part of that control. The thought of it made your stomach twist. You had been through so much already, but this was something different. You were not just going to serve wine or deliver food, you would serve them in ways that would strip you of your humanity. But you had no choice, you were their property, and in this world, property had no voice, no will. You would be molded into whatever they needed you to be, your spirit crushed under the weight of their demands. It was a slow process, a gradual loss of self. The more you complied, the more invisible you became. You weren't even a person anymore. You were just an object, a thing to be used when the moment called for it. The next evening, you were summoned to the master's chambers, where Lysander was preparing for a symposium. You were cleaned, oiled, and dressed in a tunic so thin it barely clung to your body. The fabric was designed to entice, not protect. You felt exposed, vulnerable, as you entered the room where the master and his guests waited. The men were seated on couches, their eyes already filled with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. They reclined, discussing philosophy and politics as if the very ideas they spoke of didn't contradict the reality of their lives. They spoke of justice and virtue, of democracy and rights. And yet, as the wine flowed and the evening wore on, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about ideas, but about pleasure. The first guest called for you to pour his wine, his hand lingering on your shoulder longer than necessary. You didn't flinch. You had learned not to. Your only job was to be invisible, to do as they asked without hesitation, without resistance. You served drinks. You offered grapes. You moved around the room, your body gliding over the floor like a ghost. But the looks, the lingering touches, the cold stares from across the room, they didn't escape you. You were becoming a part of their entertainment. You could feel it, the way they appraised you, the way they expected you to perform. The more compliant you were, the more they took, the more they demanded. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew darker. The conversation shifted from debates about virtue to requests for you to perform small tasks, massaging a guest's shoulders, feeding another grapes. But there were other requests, ones that made your skin crawl, ones that went beyond the boundaries of service. You didn't have a choice. The following days blurred into each other, each indistinguishable from the last, as you became more entangled in the insidious hierarchy that governed Lysander's house. Slavery here was not merely about labor. It was about control, about power dynamics that were subtly woven into every interaction. You were not only a servant but also part of a vast network of subjugation that extended far beyond the physical confines of the house. You learned quickly that the slaves at Lysander's house fell into a rigid hierarchy, each with their own function and role to play. The older slaves, like Marcus, had been there long enough to understand the system, and their survival depended on knowing where they stood within it. They had learned to read the moods of their masters and their guests, to understand which behaviors would earn them the master's favor, and which would bring punishment. There were those like Marcus, who had adapted to the system, becoming invisible enough to avoid the worst abuses but too broken to resist. Then there were the newer slaves, like you, who still clung to the fragile hope that somehow they might escape, that something might change, but it wouldn't, not here. Not in this place where every decision was made to strip away your identity and mold you into something useful to others. You were assigned to serve at the symposiums, and your role quickly became clear. You were not just a servant for drinks or food, no, you were expected to entertain. At first it was subtle, pouring wine, offering food, kneeling when asked, maintaining a constant presence in the room as you floated around, waiting for your next task. But the more time you spent among the guests, the more you began to understand that your body, your presence, was the entertainment. The guests at Lysander's house were the elite of Athens: philosophers, politicians, wealthy merchants, and respected artists. They came to discuss the matters of the day, to debate philosophy, ethics, and the nature of the good life. They prided themselves on their intellectual superiority, on the way they could engage in lofty conversations about virtue, justice, and democracy. Yet, behind closed doors, in the dimly lit rooms where the symposiums were held, the reality was very different. The same men who argued passionately for the rights of citizens, who discussed the philosophical underpinnings of justice, were the same men who used young slaves for their pleasure. They saw no contradiction in this. To them, slaves were objects, tools to be used and discarded. The system that allowed them to pursue their intellectual interests and artistic passions was built on the backs of those like you, who had no rights, no voice, and no control over their own lives. The moment you entered the room, you could feel the shift in energy. The guests, reclining on their couches, would pause their conversations, their eyes shifting to you as you entered. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of your presence as a person, only a cold, calculating appraisal. You were evaluated with the same indifference as a horse or a piece of art, judged on your appearance, your youth, and your beauty. The older slaves in the room would look away, their expressions empty, as they served their duties. They had seen this before, and they knew what was coming. The first few symposiums were a blur of strange faces and cold hands. You were nothing more than a fixture in the background, a body that moved through the room without any real purpose except to please. The men would make small requests, pouring more wine, fetching more food, but there were other requests, ones that made your skin crawl. A hand would rest too long on your shoulder, a finger would trace the line of your jaw, and when you turned away, you could feel their eyes on you, lecherous and predatory. At first you didn't understand what was happening. It was subtle. Words would be spoken to you, sometimes kind, sometimes demanding. "Come sit with me," one of the men would say, his voice soft and coaxing. "Tell me about your village, about your family." You didn't realize that these were not just simple conversations, but traps. They were testing the boundaries, seeing how far you would go before you would push back. But you didn't push back. You had no voice, no power to refuse. The first time one of the guests took you by the arm and led you to his couch, you froze. His hands were soft, too soft, and his breath smelled of wine and honey. He asked you questions that had no real meaning. Questions about where you were from, about the life you had left behind. But then his hand moved, slowly at first, brushing against your side, then lower. Your stomach churned with a mixture of fear and confusion. This wasn't what you had been told would happen, but you knew, even as your body recoiled, that there was nothing you could do. Other guests began to notice. Conversations around the room quieted, eyes shifting toward you as the scene unfolded. You were a part of the show now, no longer just a servant but a tool for their entertainment, a body to be used and consumed. Their laughter, light at first, grew louder as the wine flowed. Their voices became more demanding, their touches more insistent. In those moments, you would retreat into yourself. You had no choice but to endure. Your mind would distance itself from your body, turning into a hollow shell, an observer of its own suffering. You had learned quickly that there was no escape from this fate, no release. You were nothing but a tool to be used, a body for their pleasure, and any attempt to resist would be met with pain. But what frightened you more than anything was the knowledge that you had begun to accept it. As the weeks turned into months, the symposiums became an unbroken cycle, each one a reminder of your place in the world, a world where you were nothing more than a vessel for others' desires. The debates on philosophy, politics, and art no longer seemed to matter to you. The grand discussions on virtue, the nature of good and evil, all the intellectual ideals that these men clung to, it all felt like a distant, hollow mockery of the lives you were forced to live. You were no longer a person, you were an object, a thing that could be consumed and discarded at will. But you had learned, through bitter experience, that the key to surviving in this new world was compliance. Resistance, you had quickly discovered, led only to pain and punishment. Those who fought back were punished, severely beaten, starved, or made an example of for the others to see. It was a lesson that had become etched in your soul. To resist was to invite ruin. To comply was to survive. It wasn't just the guests at the symposiums who took part in this degradation. Lysander himself, though he was often preoccupied with his political ambitions, would occasionally join the guests in their indulgence. His eyes, cold and calculating, would study you with a possessiveness that made your skin crawl. He saw you as property, nothing more. The worst part was the way they all justified it. They spoke of justice, of virtue, as they passed their judgment on you. An innocent boy who had been sold into this world of suffering. They saw nothing wrong with using you, because to them, you were not a person. You were a tool, an instrument for their pleasure, nothing more. The contradiction between their lofty ideals and their actions was staggering. They spoke of equality, of rights, while treating you like an object to be discarded when no longer useful. As the symposiums progressed, you began to understand the rules of this new world. You learned to anticipate what was required of you before the guests even asked. When the wine was poured, you stood by silently, your hands steady as you moved from one guest to the next. But your mind was elsewhere, retreating deeper into the shadows of your own thoughts. You no longer tried to remember what it was like to be free. The boy you had once been innocent and full of dreams was long gone, replaced by something hollow, something numb. You learned to disappear into the background, becoming part of the furniture. Just another piece of the setting, a presence that existed only to serve. It was easier that way, to simply accept your place, to allow your body to become a vessel for their entertainment, while your soul remained as distant as possible. But the more you disappeared, the more it became clear that there was no escape. The other slaves had learned the same lesson. Submission was the only way to survive. Some had tried to resist, only to be punished severely. Others had given in so completely that they had lost all semblance of the people they had once been. They had been broken, their spirits crushed under the weight of the system. You had seen the signs, the vacant expressions, the hollow eyes. The way some slaves moved as if they were already dead, their bodies just going through the motions. You knew that could be you. In fact, you had already started to feel it, the slow creeping numbness that dulled your senses and emotions. It was easier not to feel, easier not to remember. But there were moments, small moments, when you would catch a glimpse of your old self, flashes of who you had been before the world had turned upside down. You would catch a fleeting memory, a scent in the air, or a sound that would briefly bring you back to a time when you had hope. It was cruel, those moments. They reminded you of what had been stolen from you, of the life you could never return to. The first time one of the guests pulled you aside for a more personal entertainment, you were too stunned to react. It wasn't the first time you had been touched, but it was the first time it felt like more than just a casual gesture. His hand had moved over your body, lingering where it shouldn't have. The way he looked at you as though you were a thing to be possessed made your stomach turn, and yet you did nothing. You had learned not to. If you showed any resistance, if you struggled, it would only make it worse. So you stood there, cold and unfeeling, as his hands moved over your body. The laughter of the others in the room faded into the background, and the clink of glasses seemed muffled, distant. You wanted to scream, to run, but your body was no longer your own. You were just an object, something to be used, and the sooner you accepted that, the sooner the pain would stop. By the time the symposiums were over, you were drained, empty, nothing but a hollow shell. The men who had used you would laugh and talk, leaving you behind like a forgotten thing. They would joke about the entertainment they had had, speaking casually about their indulgence in a way that made it clear they saw nothing wrong with it. To them, it was normal. To them, you were just a part of the game. You had become nothing but a tool for their pleasures. But the worst part was that you were starting to believe it yourself. You had become just like them. The days blurred into each other with such monotonous cruelty that you lost track of time. There was no distinction between one day and the next, no moments of rest where you could remember who you were before. Each day was the same. Wake, serve, obey, endure. The marble floors, the grand dining halls, and the laughter of Lysander's guests became a haze. You had become a fixture in his house, as much a part of thee as the ornate tapestries and polished stone. You moved through the halls as though in a trance, a ghost of yourself, performing your duties with a practiced detachment. You no longer had to think about what to do, because your body moved automatically, a machine designed for one purpose: to serve. You had learned to anticipate their every need. The wine would be poured before they asked, the food placed before they could demand it. But your mind was no longer present. You had learned to shut it off, to retreat into a place where nothing could reach you. The only moments of clarity came when you were alone in your cell, in the stillness before the next inevitable summons. In those rare moments of quiet, you would allow yourself to feel the weight of it all, but only for a moment. It was too painful to dwell on it for too long. So you quickly pushed those feelings aside, burying them beneath layers of apathy. Your body had become an instrument of obedience, a vessel for their indulgences, but it was your spirit that had suffered the most. Every night, you would lie in your straw bed, staring at the cold stone ceiling, unable to sleep, unable to escape the images that haunted your mind. You had once been a boy vibrant, full of life and hope. Now, you barely recognized the person you had become. Your reflection in the polished stone felt like a stranger. Your eyes were hollow, your face gaunt, as though the very essence of you had been drained away. You began to notice it in the other slaves, too. They had all become hollow versions of their former selves. They had long stopped speaking of escape, of hope. They had learned the only truth that mattered in this world: survival. Some had been here for years, their spirits utterly broken, their faces so devoid of emotion that they appeared lifeless. There was nothing left inside them but the need to endure, to survive another day, another symposium, another night of being used. Marcus, the boy who had once shown you the ropes, had become a shadow of the person he had been when he first arrived. His eyes were empty now, his movements mechanical. He rarely spoke, only when it was necessary, and even then, his words lacked any real emotion. He had become just like the others, a silent, broken figure moving through Lysander's house, his soul long lost. And then there were the new slaves, those who still clung to the hope that something would change, that somehow they could survive without losing themselves entirely. You could see it in their eyes, the flickers of defiance, of resistance, of something that had not yet been crushed. But you also saw the fear, the dawning realization that the life they had known was gone, replaced by a world where their worth was determined by their ability to serve and comply. The thought of them, of their innocence, was a bitter reminder of what you had lost. It hurt to see their faces, to watch the same process unfold that you had already gone through, but there was no escaping it. You had been stripped of your humanity piece by piece, until nothing was left but a hollow shell. You were no longer a person with dreams or desires. You were a thing, a tool to be used and discarded. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, you would wonder if it was better to become like the others, silent, numb, indifferent. Maybe it was the only way to survive, to stop feeling, to stop caring. But then the memories would come, those brief flashes of who you had been, and for a moment, you would wonder if there was anything left of that boy. Was there any part of him still alive, still fighting to survive? You had once believed that there was always hope, that no matter how dark things became, there would always be a way out. But the longer you stayed in Lysander's house, the more you realized how false that belief was. The system was designed to break you, to wear you down until you had nothing left but the will to serve. The more you conformed, the less you became. You were losing yourself, slowly and inexorably. And yet, despite everything, you still had moments, small moments, when you felt a glimmer of the person you used to be. When you saw a new slave, fresh from the market, with that same look of innocence in their eyes, you felt something stir within you. It was a flicker of recognition, a painful reminder of what you had once been. But even as that flicker of hope burned, you knew it wouldn't last. The system would break them too, just as it had broken you. It was a machine that had no mercy, no compassion. It consumed and discarded. It was inevitable. Days bled into one another with terrifying uniformity. You learned to move like a shadow, your presence barely acknowledged, your actions predetermined. The routines of servitude were carved into your soul, and each day became another chapter in your slow erasure. You no longer saw the world through the same eyes as before. The house, the guests, the other slaves, all of them were parts of a system that you could never escape. You had become a part of that system too, one that fed on fear and brokenness. Survival in Lysander's house required an entirely new set of skills. Physical endurance was crucial, but more important was psychological adaptation. You had learned the unspoken rules that governed life here. Anticipate the needs of your masters before they asked for anything. Every movement, every gesture, had to be calculated to avoid punishment and earn the smallest favors. There was no room for hesitation, no room for anything resembling rebellion. Each moment of non-compliance would be punished, and you knew better than to test the limits of your captivity. It didn't take long to realize that the key to survival was to blend into the background. The more invisible you were, the safer you were. You learned to make yourself small, to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention to yourself. Your existence was no longer defined by the man you had once been, but by the role you played. You were a servant, an object. You had learned to make peace with that reality, if only for the sake of your own sanity. But it wasn't just about obedience. Survival also meant understanding the unspoken language of the house, the subtle cues that revealed the desires and moods of your masters. You could read the way the guests' eyes lingered on you, how the shift in their tone indicated their intentions. You learned which men were the most dangerous, the ones who would demand more than just service, the ones who would push boundaries, who would take pleasure in your fear. You learned how to navigate their desires, how to comply with the smallest of gestures to avoid drawing their ire. You became an expert in reading the room, in understanding the power dynamics that governed every interaction. The older slaves, those like Marcus, who had been here longer than you, had mastered this art long before you. They had learned how to survive by understanding the whims of their masters, by giving the slightest hints of compliance, by becoming invisible at the right moments. They had learned that the less you fought, the less you resisted, the less likely you were to face the full force of the master's cruelty. But compliance came with its own cost. Every act of submission, every small compromise with the system, chipped away at your soul. It became easier to give in, to surrender yourself to the role you were forced to play. In time, you realized that survival required not just physical obedience, but emotional numbness. You could no longer feel the sting of their words or the coldness of their touch. You had to retreat inside yourself, to block out the pain, to shut off the part of you that remembered what it felt like to be human. In some ways, it was easier to be like the others, silent, detached, and obedient. It allowed you to avoid the overwhelming weight of your own emotions. The moments when you caught glimpses of yourself, of the person you used to be, became fleeting, distant memories. They were painful, reminders of what had been stolen from you. And so, you buried those memories deeper and deeper until they were no longer accessible. It was a survival mechanism, a way of coping with the unbearable. But there were always moments when you couldn't block out the past completely. When you saw a new slave, one who still carried that glimmer of innocence in their eyes, you felt a pang of something deep inside, a mixture of regret, guilt, and a twisted kind of hope. Hope that they might not have to suffer as you had. But that hope was fleeting, and you knew it. The system was designed to break them, just as it had broken you. You learned to hide your emotions behind a mask of compliance, to smile when required, to serve when necessary, but always with the cold knowledge that your own desires, your own needs, no longer mattered. You were not a person here. You were a tool, a servant, an object. But even as you learned to disappear, even as you buried the last vestiges of the person you had once been, there was something inside you that refused to die. It was a flicker, a tiny ember of resistance, buried deep within the recesses of your mind. You didn't know what it was, but it was there. You had lost your voice, but not entirely. There were nights, long after the masters had retreated to their rooms, when you would lie awake in your small cell, staring at the ceiling, and you would let yourself remember. You would think of your family, of the village that once was, of the life that you had been robbed of. You would imagine what it might have been like had things been different. But these moments never lasted long. The reality of your situation would crash in, reminding you of your place, and you would quickly shut the thoughts away. The world you had known was gone. This was your reality now, and all that mattered was survival. Even as the numbness settled deeper, there were still moments when the urge to resist would flicker within you. It was fleeting, like a brief flame in the dark, but it was there, in the quietest moments, in the spaces between the routines. You could feel the stirrings of your humanity, the part of you that still remembered defiance, still longed for freedom. It was a dangerous thought, a reminder of everything you had lost. But it existed, and it could not be ignored. You saw it in the new slaves who arrived, fresh from the market, still wide-eyed with the terror of their fate. They had not yet learned the rules. the unspoken language of survival in Lysander's house. They didn't know how to read the guests, how to anticipate the unspoken demands. They had not yet learned to fade into the background, to remain unnoticed, to disappear entirely. The youngest among them were the most vulnerable. Their fear was palpable. They still had that spark, that resistance to being reduced to mere tools. You could see it in the way they looked at the others, those of you who had already been broken. They saw the emptiness in your eyes and couldn't yet understand how they had gotten there. The older slaves who had survived longer than you watched with a kind of knowing sympathy, but they didn't offer comfort. They didn't offer hope. They couldn't. They had learned long ago that hope only led to more suffering. But then there were those who resisted in their own quiet ways. Marcus had long since given up his fight, but you saw it in other small acts of rebellion that could easily be dismissed. A look that lingered too long, a moment where a slave would refuse to serve, not out of malice, but out of the sheer will to preserve something of themselves. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make you wonder if it was possible to reclaim the pieces of yourself that had been lost. These acts of resistance weren't loud. They weren't visible to the masters or to the guests. They didn't cause disruption. They were quiet, secretive, like tiny sparks that could, in the right circumstances, ignite something greater. But you had learned that there was a price to resistance. The punishment would be swift and brutal. You had witnessed it in others who had tried, who had struggled against the crushing weight of the system only to be broken further, made examples of for everyone else. The system was designed to squash any resistance, no matter how small. The more you resisted, the more they would take. It was a silent, insidious war. Every act of defiance was met with a response, an increase in punishment, a loss of privileges, a reminder of your place. The small victories came at a cost, and the cost was often too great to bear. You saw this with Alexios, a young man who had been here for longer than you, though not as long as the others. He had tried to fight back once, refusing to comply with an order that seemed particularly cruel. He had been beaten severely, left in the courtyard for days without food or water as an example to the others. His back had been scarred from the whips, and his spirit had been broken. After that, he no longer resisted. He had learned that resistance led only to more pain, and the cost of fighting back was too high. But there was another way, one that you had learned from the older slaves. It wasn't about defiance, it was about survival. It was about giving them what they wanted without actually giving anything of yourself. It was about compliance. Yes, but compliance with a kind of calculated detachment. You didn't have to care, you just had to serve. It was a bitter compromise. You learned to disappear completely, to become as invisible as possible. The less they saw you, the less you were asked to give. You moved like a shadow, blending into the walls of Lysander's house, becoming part of the furniture. You spoke when necessary, but never more than that. You served with the precision of a machine, but without the need to feel anything. You had learned to shut off the parts of yourself that felt pain, that remembered what it meant to be human. The others did the same. You shared silent glances, small nods, the kind of communication that wasn't spoken but understood. You didn't need to speak the same language anymore. Survival had become its own language. You had learned how to read each other, how to share small moments of solidarity, knowing that this was the only way to preserve what was left of you. There were moments when you would see the new slaves, those who had arrived with hope in their eyes, still holding on to the belief that somehow they could make it out. You would look at them, and part of you wanted to tell them the truth, but you knew better. You knew that hope here was a cruel illusion. The system would break them just as it had broken you. The only thing left was survival, and survival required complete surrender to the system. But even as you shut off parts of yourself, even as you became more and more invisible, you couldn't entirely erase the flicker of defiance inside you. It was there, buried deep, a part of you that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of everything. One evening, as the usual evening guests arrived for another symposium, a new group of slaves was brought in, a fresh batch, still trembling with fear, still clinging to the small thread of hope that hadn't yet been shattered. They were young, some barely into their teenage years, others closer to your own age when you had first arrived. You saw their eyes as they were led through the halls wide with the terror of the unknown. The kind of fear that only comes from realizing your life has been stolen and there's no way to retrieve it. They were unaware of the system they were about to enter, of the intricate web of power and submission that would soon shape every aspect of their existence. They had not yet learned the language of survival that you had become fluent in. You had seen it too many times. Each new slave who arrived, carrying with them the last remnants of their former selves, only to be consumed by the machine that was Lysander's household. The first few days were the worst for them, filled with confusion, fear, and the disorienting realization that they would never see their homes again. The older slaves, those like you who had long ago surrendered any trace of defiance, watched them with pity in their eyes. But no one spoke, no one offered comfort. It wasn't that you didn't care, it was that you knew what was coming. To comfort them was to remind yourself of everything you had lost. To remember the boy you had once been, the one who still had dreams, who still believed there was hope. You tried not to think about it, tried not to look at the new slaves too closely, but you couldn't help it. The familiarity of their terror reminded you of the day you had arrived. You had been just like them, scared, lost and unprepared for the horror that would follow. You remembered how they had led you into Lysander's house with cold hands, with eyes that saw you only as a possession, a tool to be used. But now, the fear had settled deep inside you, woven into your bones. The new slaves would learn that same fear. In time, they would come to understand that the only way to survive in this place was to surrender, to become part of the machine that kept everything running. For the first time in a long while, you found yourself watching one of the new slaves closely. He was small, younger than you had been when you first arrived, with a face that still held some trace of innocence. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his body trembling slightly as the overseers instructed him on what to do. You saw the way he flinched when they spoke to him, as if he expected a blow, a punishment. You saw the confusion on his face as he tried to make sense of his new reality. There was a part of you that wanted to warn him, to tell him how the system worked, to help him avoid the worst of the punishments. But you knew better than to try. The more you cared, the more you would suffer. You had learned that the only way to protect yourself was to become numb to their pain, to shut off the part of you that remembered what it meant to care. Still, as you watched him, a small part of you wondered, could he escape the fate that awaited him? Could he avoid the slow crushing of his spirit that had happened to you? You knew the answer already. No one escaped. Not really. You caught Marcus' eye across the room, and for a moment, you saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. He had once been like this new slave, young, hopeful, unaware of the darkness that would soon consume him. You could see it in the way he watched the new arrivals. There was a resigned sadness in his eyes now, a knowledge of what was to come. It was the same sadness you had learned to wear. Don't get too attached, Marcus whispered to you, his voice low, barely audible. They'll break him just like they broke us. You didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. You had all been broken in different ways, but the end result was the same. The new slaves would become part of the system, and in time, they would learn to blend in, to become invisible, just as you had. It was the only way to survive. As the night wore on, the new slaves were quietly integrated into the routines. They were assigned to the various tasks: pouring wine, serving food, cleaning the rooms after the guests had finished. They were watched closely, their every movement scrutinized by the overseers and the other slaves. They would learn quickly what was expected of them, what could be tolerated and what would result in punishment. You could already see the shift in their eyes, the first flickers of resignation. The spark of defiance that had once existed in their faces was beginning to fade. They were learning to accept their new reality, to accept that they had no choice but to serve. And as they learned to survive, as they began to disappear into the system, you couldn't help but feel a small pang of guilt. You had given up your resistance long ago, but somewhere deep inside, you still felt the weight of the boy you had once been, the one who had dared to dream of freedom. Now all you could do was watch. The days in Lysander's house blurred into an endless routine. The cycle of service, submission, and survival repeated with chilling consistency. The new slaves, just as you had once been, were learning the brutal rhythm of life here. They were beginning to see the cracks in the facade, the ways in which the grand house that Lysander called home was built on the backs of those who had no voice, no agency. As time passed, you began to notice small shifts in the new arrivals. The once bright spark in their eyes, the defiance that had lingered in the way they stood, began to dim. It was subtle at first, small changes in their posture, their movements. They started to learn the language of compliance, the way to avoid punishment by being invisible, by blending into the background. It was a survival mechanism, a way to avoid becoming the target of the overseer's wrath. You remembered your own transformation, the slow but inevitable erosion of your spirit. You remembered the boy you had been, the one who had still dreamed of something better, of escape, of freedom. But that boy was long gone, replaced by someone who had learned to bury his emotions, to shut off his humanity in order to survive. Every night, as you lay on your thin mattress, you would hear the quiet sobs of the new slaves in their cells. Some still clung to the hope that things could change, that they could somehow resist, but it was only a matter of time before they would break. The system was too powerful, too ingrained. It had existed for centuries, and no one had ever escaped it. You had learned that hope was a luxury you couldn't afford. It was too dangerous to hope here, to dream of a life beyond the walls of Lysander's house. You had learned to close yourself off from those feelings, to disconnect from the emotions that threatened to surface. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when the memories of your past life, of your family, your village, the person you had once been would come rushing back. And in those moments you would feel something stir inside you, something that refused to die completely. It was a painful reminder that you were not entirely lost, that there was still a part of you that remembered what it meant to be human. But you had learned, through harsh experience, that such memories were dangerous. They kept you tethered to a world that no longer existed. To survive here, in this house of opulence and cruelty, you had to let go of the past. You had to erase everything that made you who you were, to become a ghost in the system, moving without being seen, serving without feeling. Only then could you escape the worst of the abuse. And yet, even as you mastered the art of emotional detachment, you still saw the flickers of hope in the eyes of the new slaves. The way they would look at each other, sharing quiet, unspoken conversations, offering a shred of comfort to one another when the overseers weren't looking. They didn't understand yet that the system didn't just break your body, it broke your soul. It was a slow, insidious process, one that wore you down over time until you were nothing more than a hollow shell. Sometimes, you would catch glimpses of yourself in the new slaves, in the way they tried to hold on to their dignity, to their sense of self, and it made you ache, because you knew what was coming for them. You knew that they would lose that spark, just as you had, that they would be swallowed by the system, until nothing was left but an obedient servant, a compliant tool, just like you. It was a cycle, one that never ended. Every time a new slave arrived, they would go through the same process, the same brutal lessons, the same loss of innocence, the same erasure of self. They would be broken, molded into a shape that could survive the horrors of Lysander's house. And then, just like you, they would become part of the system, part of the machine that kept everything running. The cycle was inescapable, but there were times, in the quiet of the night, when you wondered if it had to be this way. Could there be another path? Could you find a way to hold on to your humanity, to resist, to survive without losing everything? You didn't know the answer, but deep inside, buried beneath the layers of pain and numbness, there was still a small part of you that refused to give up. It was a fragile hope, a flicker of light in the dark, but it was there. And somehow, despite everything, that small part of you still believed that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. The arrival of new slaves always felt like a personal wound reopening. Each time it happened, you couldn't help but feel the pang of recognition, the fear in their eyes, the confusion on their faces. It was a reminder of your own arrival, that first time you had been thrust into this world, unprepared and terrified. The new ones were just like you had been, full of uncertainty and misplaced hope, but you could also see it how quickly they started to understand. It only took a few days for them to realize that there was no escape. The system would eat them alive, just as it had eaten you. They would learn the rules of survival, how to move quietly, how to avoid attracting attention, how to comply without resistance. It was a brutal, soul-crushing process, but it was the only way to live here. You watched them, unable to turn away. Some of them were barely older than children, their faces still soft with the innocence of youth. They hadn't yet learned the art of disappearance, the subtle trick of becoming invisible in a world that didn't see you as a person. They still looked at each other with hope, with the belief that something might change, that they could somehow resist. It was painful to watch, because you knew what awaited them. You had already lived through it, and you could see the signs, the little cracks in their resolve, the first tremors of fear, the first moments of compliance. It wouldn't take long before they too learned the language of survival, the language of submission. It would take longer for them to lose themselves entirely, but they would eventually become just like you, ghosts, moving through the house with no more than a faint echo of who they had once been. Some of the older slaves would try to offer comfort, but it was a hollow gesture. They would tell the new arrivals not to fight, to be compliant, to survive. They would say that this was the only way, but there was no comfort in that truth. There was no comfort in knowing that the life they had once known was gone, and that they were now part of the system that consumed everything in its path. But even as you watched them, a part of you still wished they could escape it, that they could hold on to something, anything that was theirs. A part of you still longed for the freedom you had once taken for granted, for the simple pleasures of life that seemed so far out of reach now. It was during these moments that the weight of it all threatened to crush you, the overwhelming sense of despair that filled every corner of Lysander's house, the hopelessness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. You had learned to carry it, to live with it, but it didn't make it any easier. The guests came and went, their laughter echoing through the halls as you and the other slaves served them. It was the same routine, day in and day out. But the new slaves, the ones who still had something of themselves left, seemed to shine with a fragile light. They were not yet broken, not yet erased. They were still human, still capable of feeling, still capable of hope. You tried not to look at them too closely, because each time you did, you were reminded of everything you had lost. But there was also something in their eyes, a spark that refused to die. You wanted to believe that it could be different for them, that somehow they might find a way to survive without losing everything. But deep down, you knew the truth. You knew that the system was too strong, too entrenched. The longer they stayed, the more they would fade, the more they would learn to disappear, to serve without thought, to exist without feeling. It was a slow process, but it was inevitable. And so, you watched them, and you felt the weight of their fate pressing down on you. The cycle would repeat, the system would continue. The new slaves would become part of it, just as you had. There was no escape, no way out, and in the silence of your cell, you could almost hear the echoes of your own past, of the person you had once been, the boy who had dreamed of something more. But now, all that remained was survival. As the days continued to blur into one another, you felt the shift inside yourself, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet inescapable. You began to realize that you had become a part of the system, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The cruelty, once something you had fought against, had seeped into your very being. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about staying alive long enough to endure another day. It had become a part of who you were. You had learned, over the months and years, that survival was not only about physical compliance, but also about emotional surrender. You had once clung to your memories, to the image of the boy you had been, the boy who had dreamed of freedom, of escape, of life outside the cold stone walls of Lysander's house. But now those memories were fading, slipping away like sand through your fingers. The longer you stayed in this place, the more you forgot who you had been. Your mind had become a battleground. You would tell yourself that the old you no longer mattered, that he was lost to the past. It was easier to let him go, to let the system shape you into something that could survive. But the cost of that survival was high. The more you allowed the system to dictate your actions, your thoughts, your very being, the more it consumed you. You had become part of the machinery, just another tool in Lysander's household, and you no longer knew where the man you had been ended and the tool you had become began. You had seen it happen to the others, the older slaves who had been in the house for years. their minds and spirits broken by the endless cycle of abuse and submission. They no longer questioned, no longer resisted. They were nothing but shadows of their former selves, empty shells that moved through the house with mechanical precision. They had long since stopped fighting for any sense of dignity, and now they simply existed. They had learned that to survive was to lose everything. At first, you had fought it. You had resisted the process, held on to the small pieces of yourself that still remembered who you were. But as the months stretched into years, those pieces began to erode. It was impossible to hold on to your humanity in a place where everything, every action, every thought, every desire was controlled by the will of others. The system didn't just break you physically, it wore you down mentally and emotionally, until there was nothing left but a hollow, obedient shell. But you still tried to resist, not outwardly, not in any way that could be seen or noticed, but deep inside. In the quiet moments when you were alone in your cell, or when you served the guests in their decadent symposiums, there were moments when the flicker of defiance would return, when you would remember that there had once been a person inside this body, a person who had dreamed of something more than just survival. It was during these moments that you would look at the new slaves, the ones who had not yet been broken, and wonder if they could escape the fate that had already claimed you. Could they survive without losing themselves completely? Could they hold on to their humanity long enough to find a way out? But you knew better. You had seen how quickly the new slaves were absorbed into the system, how their hope faded, how their eyes became empty. It wasn't just about the physical labor, the hours spent serving at the symposiums, or the endless tasks that filled each day. It was about the emotional and psychological toll that the system took on you, the constant erosion of your sense of self, the constant reminders that you were nothing, that you were only valuable as long as you could serve. The cruelty was not just physical, it was psychological. It was the way they looked at you, the way they touched you, the way they spoke to you. It was the way the guests treated you as an object, a toy to be played with and discarded. It was the way Lysander looked at you with detached ownership, as though you were nothing more than a piece of furniture. And it was the way the system had conditioned you to accept it, to see yourself as nothing more than a tool to erase any trace of the person you had been before. You had learned to accept the cruelty, to internalize it, to believe that it was your rightful place. It wasn't just about submitting to your masters, it was about submitting to the idea that you were worth less than they were, that your pain didn't matter. As you lay on your straw mattress at night, you could feel the weight of this internalized cruelty pressing down on you. It was suffocating, like a heavy blanket that smothered any flicker of resistance, any glimmer of hope. You had learned to stop caring, because caring only led to more pain. But deep inside, buried under the layers of numbness, a small part of you still resisted. The internal battle had become almost unbearable. The longer you spent in Lysander's house, the more you realized that your survival was built on the cost of your soul. You had learned how to play the role of a compliant slave, how to follow orders with no more than a hollow, mechanical precision, but at what cost? The boy you had once been, the one full of hope, had been lost somewhere in the depths of your suffering, replaced by a creature who had learned to survive by erasing the parts of yourself that made you human. You moved through the house with an eerie calm, your every action dictated by the need to serve, to please, to survive. The more you complied, the more invisible you became, the safer you were from the worst cruelties. You had learned how to stay out of sight when the guests demanded their pleasures, how to anticipate their needs before they even voiced them. It was the art of survival, a survival that came at the expense of everything that once defined you. You had lost count of how many times you had served the guests at the symposiums, how many times you had been asked to dance on the edge of degradation, to serve them in ways that stripped you of your dignity. It had become routine. Pour the wine, serve the food, sit quietly, wait for the command, and obey. It was all you could do. Resistance had long been beaten out of you, not by physical force, but by the psychological toll of endless submission. You had become part of the system, a cog in the machine. The thought of escape of rebellion no longer seemed possible. It wasn't just the physical barriers that kept you locked in place. It was the way the system had molded you, had conditioned you to believe that there was no other way to live. Your worth was now defined by how well you served, by how invisible you could make yourself. To even entertain the thought of defiance was a dangerous indulgence, one that would only bring pain. But there were moments, rare fleeting moments, when you would catch a glimpse of the person you had been, and you would wonder if it was still possible to escape, to break free from the cycle of abuse. It happened when you saw a new slave, a fresh face filled with that same terror and hope that had once been in your own eyes. They hadn't yet learned that compliance was the only path to survival. They hadn't yet been broken. You felt a pang in your chest each time you saw that spark of hope. You knew it would be gone soon. It was only a matter of time before the system consumed them too. The thought of it made your stomach turn. You remembered your own fear, your own hope, and how quickly it had been crushed. The system didn't just break your body, it broke your spirit, your sense of self. Somehow, through it all, you had managed to hold on to one thing: the belief that your survival, while it had cost you everything else, was a victory of sorts. The only reason you had made it this far was because you had learned how to shut off the pain, how to bury the part of you that felt anything. It wasn't a triumph, it was merely the price of staying alive. But even as you told yourself this, you knew that the price of survival was too high. You had surrendered everything: your innocence, your hope, your sense of self. You had traded them for a chance to live, for a chance to endure the endless cycle of servitude that kept you alive. It wasn't much of a life, but it was all you had. And now, as the new slaves entered the house, as they began to understand what awaited them, you felt a sickening sense of déjà vu. You saw their faces, their terror, and you knew exactly what they were feeling. You wanted to warn them, to tell them the truth about what awaited them, but you knew better. Telling them would only bring more pain, more suffering. There was no way to change the system. It had existed for too long, too deeply ingrained in the very fabric of life in Lysander's house. You had tried, once, to fight back. Once, you had believed that there could be something more than just survival. But the system had crushed that belief, just as it had crushed you. And now, you existed in the only way you knew how. By surviving, by giving up everything that mattered, by disappearing into the walls, into the shadows. The cost of survival had been high, but somehow, you had made it this far. And as the new slaves arrived, you couldn't help but wonder, how long could you continue this way? How long could you keep your humanity buried beneath the weight of the system? The house continued its endless routine, each day melding into the next with no real distinction between them. You had long since stopped counting the days, the weeks, the months. It had become irrelevant. What mattered now was survival, pure and simple. But even in the heart of your numbness, there was something stirring, something that refused to be completely extinguished. The new slaves were fully integrated into the system now, their spirits in varying degrees of degradation. Some had learned quickly how to comply, how to serve without hesitation. Others, like you had once been, were still holding on to fragments of hope. It was painful to watch, knowing that their time was running out, knowing that soon they would be broken, just as you had been. But amidst the quiet despair of the house, there was something small, but it was there. You began to notice the smallest shifts in your mind. The numbness that had been so pervasive, so all-consuming, started to crack ever so slightly. It was almost imperceptible, like the first hint of light breaking through a storm-clouded sky. But it was enough to make you question everything that had led you here. One night, as you served Lysander's guests at yet another symposium, you caught a glimpse of one of the new slaves' face, still fresh with that naive hope, his eyes still unbroken. He was serving wine to a guest, the same guest who had looked at you in that same predatory way when you first arrived. You watched them interact, saw the subtle exchange of power as the guest's hand lingered on the young slave's arm. Something inside you snapped. It wasn't much, but it was enough. You saw it, the helplessness, the way the new slave stiffened under the touch, the way he flinched, and you realized that he was already beginning to be broken. A wave of fury rose within you, an emotion that you hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. You knew what was happening to him, knew exactly how this would unfold, and you couldn't let it go on, not this time, not again. For the first time in years, you stood there and did not comply. You didn't wait to be given the next command. You didn't make yourself invisible. You simply stared, your eyes locked onto the guest's hand that was still resting on the slave's arm, as if time had stopped for just a moment. The look in your eyes was clear. You would no longer allow this to happen. The guest noticed you then, the shift in your gaze, the defiance that was small but undeniable. He raised an eyebrow, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. But you didn't look away. For a fleeting second, you felt the full weight of your actions, the tension of what might come next. A dangerous game, but one you were willing to play. Before anyone could say anything, Demetrius, the overseer, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the subtle tension in the room. He had seen the flicker of defiance in your eyes. He knew it for what it was, an act of resistance. He had been waiting for this moment, had known it would come eventually. He stepped toward you with purpose, his hand reaching for your arm to pull you away. But as he did, something inside you shifted again. You pulled away, not in fear, not in compliance, but with something you hadn't felt in years, a sense of agency, a flicker of autonomy. You weren't just an object anymore. For the first time, you remembered what it felt like to make a choice, to have a say in your own fate. Demetrius's eyes flared with fury as he grabbed your arm tighter. But this time, you didn't let him drag you away. You didn't resist violently, but you didn't comply either. You stood there, your gaze locked with his, and in that moment, you felt something stir deep inside you, a piece of yourself that had been buried for so long, but had never truly died. It was a small act, but in that moment, it felt like everything. It wasn't rebellion, not in the traditional sense. You weren't throwing a punch, you weren't fleeing, but you had stood firm. You had refused to bend in the face of the system. You had made a choice. And in that choice you had reclaimed a small piece of yourself, the part that refused to accept complete dehumanization. Demetrius's grip tightened, and he hissed something in your ear about punishment, about consequences. But you no longer feared those words. You had endured far worse. You had endured enough. The moment passed quickly, and soon, you were pulled from the room, your body being forced back into the shadows where it belonged. Demetrius's punishment was swift, as expected. He beat you, but it was different this time. It wasn't the same as before. This time you felt the pain, but you also felt the strange strength that came with standing up, even for a moment. It was a strange sense of power that had eluded you for so long. It hurt, but it was a reminder that you were still alive, still capable of resisting. The beating ended, and you were thrown into your cell like so many times before, the door slamming shut behind you. You lay there, your body bruised and battered, but your mind was awake. Something had shifted. You had taken back a small piece of yourself, and it felt like a victory, even if it was a quiet one. As you lay there in the dark, you couldn't help but wonder, could this be the beginning? Could this small act of defiance be the start of something more? You didn't know. You didn't know if you had the strength to truly fight back, to escape the system that had claimed you for so long. But for the first time in years, the question seemed possible.